Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly podcast, a show for people who are big on cities but short on time. I'm Vanessa Quirk. Eric, did you hear about the story of the emus that were banned from a hotel bar in Australia?
I'm not surprised. Have you ever seen an emu after a few white Russians? I'm not surprised they were banned.
I don't think I've ever seen an emu full stop, let alone, inebriated emus.
I mean, this story was remarkable.
Liberal use of the word remarkable, but yes, go ahead.
They're mainstays at this hotel, right?
Yes.
And then one day they learned how to climb stairs.
Yes.
And so, of course, what did they do next after they climbed stairs? They went to the bar, right? And one of them got caught going behind the bar. To me, this is not like a cause to get banned. This is like evolution.
This is innovation. We should be,
right?
Praising the innovation of the emus.
You've arrived as a species when you're ready to destroy yourself with alcohol. So I think, congratulations to the emus. And hello to you, city lovers. Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly. I'm Eric Jaffe. We'll spend the next 20 minutes or so discussing the biggest stories from the urban tech world, and we'll talk with journalist Laura Raskin about an architectural approach called desert urbanism. When time's up on a segment, you'll hear our little bicycle bell. This week, our top stories look at why zoning changes aren't enough to lower housing costs, why algorithms might actually help us fight discrimination, and whether flexible walls can bring people back into the office.
Okay, let's get into that first story.
All right, that first piece comes from Emily Hamilton, writing at Bloomberg City Lab, who writes about, there's a lot of cities that have started to reform or even eliminate single-family zoning requirements to help improve housing affordability. But she writes, that is not enough to actually make the progress we need. So, Vanessa, walk us through this case.
Sure thing. So, great piece from Emily Hamilton. And we've talked about this issue before on the show, but not for a little while. And also, it's just really worth repeating. What is single-family zoning exactly? It's just rules that say that the only thing that you can build in a certain area is a detached single-family home. Right? And so when you eliminate single-family zoning, you're not saying that people can't build them. You're just giving people options to build other types of housing. I think that's important to just reiterate because the rhetoric can get confusing here. So the other thing that's kind of interesting to note is that this isn't just a suburban thing. Even though people often kind of think about single-family homes and suburbia as kind of an exclusive relationship there, it's not true. There are significant amounts of urban areas that have these types of rules in place.
That's right. In San Francisco, 38% of residential land is zoned as single-family only. And in Seattle, it's actually 80%. So again, places we think of as big, dense U.S. urban areas, they still have these rules.
That's right. And some cities have been taking the actions to start relaxing them to try and encourage development of more housing so that hopefully we can reduce housing costs, right? And I think Minneapolis is the prime example here. They went through this reform last year. And their idea was not to, plop skyscrapers down in cul-de-sacs, but they did allow you to start building, 2-family townhouses, small multifamily buildings, maybe even backyard cottages. And the idea there is that you can make these areas more affordable, but not in such a drastic way,
Right. It's often called the missing middle.
Yeah.
That's short for mid-range buildings, mid-sized buildings. Also can come to mean kind of middle-income households. Right. So yeah, not skyscrapers.
That's right. And this is where Emily Hamilton is saying that, we can't focus only on single-family zoning when it comes to creating more of this missing middle housing, right? And she says it's actually distracting if we're only focusing on that because there are a lot of rules beyond single-family zoning that kind of limit the creation of this kind of housing. There's like an ecosystem, a regulatory ecosystem here, right?
Maybe you call it a cottage industry.
Not a backyard cottage industry. But these kinds of laws are like minimum lot size requirements, parking requirements, height limits. And so she's saying that unless you're addressing all of these together, it might not help. Right? One example that she gives is in Houston. And she mentions, they used to have a minimum lot size of 5,000 square feet. Then they reduced it to 1,400 square feet. And that made it possible for developers to replace a single family home with 3 townhouses. And that increased the supply, right? And Hamilton does note that Houston's median home price is actually below the national average, despite the big growth that they've been having. So, of course, we don't know if this one change alone caused the outcome, but it certainly helped. And it kind of emphasizes that this is an important lever to pull beyond single-family zoning.
Yeah, it certainly seemed to help. And that is her point, right? We need these things in tandem. We need these things in coordination. We saw another example this week from Edmonton in Canada, our friends up north. And this was a story about how Edmonton has eliminated its minimum parking requirements, which was another one of the rules on Emily Hamilton's list here. This is a story from an urbanist website, a new one actually, called Reasons to be Cheerful. Stories from Ashley Salvador. Yeah, check it out. I encourage folks. Really great work. But this is a great topic, one we've written about at Sidewalk Talk. Right. And basically what a minimum parking requirement says is it tells a developer you must provide a certain amount of parking regardless of whether or not a tenant wants that parking. So because parking spaces are very expensive to build in the tens of thousands of dollars, what happens is developers have to build them and then they bundle these costs into your apartment costs and your rent goes up.
Yeah.
Again, even if you don't want to park somewhere, even if you don't need to.
Right.
So Edmonton became the first major Canadian city to eliminate this rule, and it did it, again, in conjunction with eliminating single-family zoning. Those two things complement each other.
For sure. And one final caveat here, though, we should say that this piece was really about creating missing middle housing or middle income housing. When it comes to, low income housing, that really requires a kind of heavier hand from the government and to kind of create more housing opportunities for those folks. So kind of a different issue with a different set of solutions.
That's right. We need all kinds of solutions.
That's right. So for our second story, we're going to go from zoning rules to algorithms.
This is why the show is so popular, by the way.
Hey, our audience is avid and curious about a lot of things, Eric.
I wasn't joking.
So in this story is from a group of computer scientists and public policy experts writing together in a scientific journal, PNAS, which I didn't know stands for Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Sounds very official. And they argue that algorithms might actually help us stop discrimination. So Eric, this seems a little bit backwards compared to a lot of the stories that we've been reading about algorithms lately. So can you unpack their argument here?
I can. Fortunately for you and our listeners, I understand algorithms perfectly. So I'm not going to make any mistakes here at all. And I will explain it as clearly as humanly possible. So we try to unpack this like bit by bit, right? So at the very basic level, human beings are flawed, present company excluded maybe. But even those of us with good intentions, we can discriminate against others at times, even when we're not trying to, right? We have implicit biases. We don't always know why we make certain decisions.
Right, like the decision to let you talk about algorithms on the show.
That's right. Why did you make that decision, right?
I don't know.
And you never will. We have flaws. And what we've been seeing lately is that computer algorithms, because they're built by humans, naturally reflect some of these biases, some of these flaws, some of these unintentional discriminatory tendencies. And so there are kind of a lot of types of algorithms that you could discuss here. The one they talk about in the paper is really a machine learning algorithm.
Right.
And that just means they get trained. The algorithm gets trained using data. It ultimately learns to make a decision or a recommendation based on that training.
And I know we talked about an example of this a couple weeks back, actually, when we did that show on facial recognition and policing, right? So that software had been trained to identify faces so that police could help catch criminals, right? But that was trained with data that included mostly white faces. So it was actually quite bad at recognizing black faces. And as a result, the police in Detroit wrongly arrested a black man as a result.
Yeah, and that was kind of the first case of its kind, but I think it won't be the last one. And it's a really great example because clearly in this case, the algorithm was biased, right?
Yeah.
Based on the training, that flawed training. And we should also note, of course, very important in this example, there is a separate, again, but very critical question about whether such tools should ever be used, right? This is a separate question that all cities are wrestling with.
Yeah.
But let's try to set that aside. It's not a trivial point. Let's try to set it aside for the moment, though, and think of this example in terms of what the researchers are talking about here and making their case. Because their point in the paper is that our current laws are structured in such a way as to really perpetuate those human biases that get transferred into a computer algorithm. So they say maybe if we change our laws, if we tweak them a bit, eventually it could be possible, and they stress very possible, not certain here, that algorithms could actually help us detect and prevent bias in a way that, as you pointed out earlier, we just can't do with people because we don't know what drives their decisions always.
Yeah, this is like the important point, I think, from this paper, this focusing in on our laws and our regulatory structure. But it's a little hard to wrap your head around. So let me just try and use that Detroit example from earlier to kind of flesh out their thinking. So in that case, if you had asked a police officer, why are you arresting someone? They could give you a lot of reasons, and they probably wouldn't say that race was a reason. And it would be really hard to prove if race were a factor. But if you use that facial recognition software, and as a result of a legal query, you could investigate the algorithm behind that software, then you could find out that it was trained on white faces, and you would have proof that it was biased and discriminatory. And that is a big shift. And I think that's what the paper's trying to get at, that you have more possibility for detecting discrimination with proof.
That's exactly right. They're calling to kind of change the legal structure to create that greater transparency into the way the algorithm operates, into the way the algorithm was trained, because obviously in this case of Detroit, there were lots of problems here. Yeah. But the training was certainly a problem, and it injected harmful bias into that outcome.
Right. And another point that the researchers made is that, right now, it would not be illegal for a company or any entity to delete the training model and just keep the decision-making part of the algorithm. And in that case, you would not have the transparency to help fix the problem. Yeah. So they kind of highlight another regulatory issue at play that would need to be addressed if algorithms were to be better at detecting discrimination.
Okay, and I know we're out of time here, but I'll let the researchers have the final word. And they say, quote, "In principle," and we emphasize those cautionary words, "algorithms therefore have the potential to become a force for social justice by serving as powerful detectors of human discrimination."
Well, let's hope that possibility becomes actual, yeah.
All right, our final top story of the week comes from Amanda Mull, who's writing at The Atlantic, and she explains that after decades of building open plan offices, personal office space is finally back in style, thanks to COVID-19. Guess that's a silver lining. But to get there, we need to bring walls back into office spaces. So, Vanessa, tell us how we get that done.
So obviously this was a big week in office-related news, right? Our sibling company, Google, actually announced that employees will have the option to work remote until July 2021, which is a year from now. So that is a very big signal for just, how far off we might be in terms of, returning to offices and creating safe office spaces for workers.
Yeah, and we should kind of note that, of course, this doesn't impact all types of workers, only those like us who kind of are working remote now and have the luxury of going into an office.
That's right.
Or working from home. Essential service workers, of course, have been going into hospitals, have been going into grocery stores, working on transit buses nonstop since COVID hit, and they've been saving us.
Yeah, absolutely. So we should not disregard their reality is quite different from the reality that Amanda Mull is talking about here. And so what she's writing about is, one of the problems about getting workers back into offices safely is that, in the past few decades, we've spent a lot of time and effort creating open plan offices or open office plans that just eliminate personal space, right? And the tech industry has been a big, proponent of this kind of model. They've pushed, from the early 2000s onwards. Closed door offices and cubicles just got removed for open spaces, shared desks, open common spaces, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and there was a great quote in this piece here of an architect kind of explaining the rationale behind open space offices. And he said, "The angel on my left shoulder says an open office engendered greater collaboration. The devil on my right shoulder said it was sometimes cheaper to build."
Yeah, this is a very good point. I mean, architects talk a big game about, the serendipitous encounters of the open plan office, but you really have to admit there are dollars and cents incentives to keep these spaces open. And they have drawbacks, right? I mean, anyone who's worked in an open plan office knows, noise can be a problem. Lack of privacy is a problem. And now we know in the time of COVID that spreading germs will definitely be a problem.
Coughing is a problem.
Exactly. So Amanda Mull writes, walls have started to creep back into the places where they had been banished. So she talks about things like, temporary partitions coming in, plexiglass dividers. Yeah. And so this adjustment now, this reintroduction of walls is actually really interesting to us at Sidewalk because we've been thinking a while about this idea of flexible walls, right? We talked about it a little bit in the City of the Future episode, the STOA episode. One of the big challenges in making walls, quote unquote flexible, i.e. that you could kind of remove or put up easily, is electrical wiring and plumbing, actually, because those tend to be baked into walls. And, today, if you want to move a wall, you got to knock that down. You have to redesign the space. You need to get a plumber and an electrician in to rewire. It takes time. It takes money. And so we've been thinking about, how could you design a walled unit that, is naturally flexible by kind of taking out that harder infrastructure and designing the whole unit in a way that the walls could actually then move around and flex according to, your needs at that moment.
That's right. And a couple ways that we've gone about doing this that work still in its early stages, but we've talked about kind of using digital electricity to run power via Ethernet cables. And these are much easier to kind of hide under the baseboard of a wall instead of kind of embedding them within the wall so that you can move the whole wall unit and just move the baseboard. And we think you can cut kind of half the time off renovation. Also, sprinkler systems. Similarly, with mist-based sprinklers, you can run these little tubes, again, either on the ceiling or the baseboard, and they're equally powerful to the kind of standard sprinklers we see today. They're used in ships. They're used in art museums. They actually do less water damage overall. So, we're running out of time, but this is not just about offices. These are the types of flexible walls. They could help schools. They could actually convert office space into housing. We're seeing these stories come up more and more. If companies really aren't going to go back into the office, maybe we can use that space for housing. Flexible walls could play a role there. So it's a really important topic.
An exciting urban innovation that hopefully we'll see more of in the future. Well, that is it for the top stories this week. As always, you can find the links to these stories in the podcast episode notes. Up next, we're going to talk with journalist Laura Raskin about desert urbanism, which is, an increasingly hot topic in our ever-warming world. Yes.
Very well.
Back in a sec. We are now joined by journalist Laura Raskin, who joins us today to discuss the work of Phoenix-based Studio Ma, an architecture firm that strives to design low-energy and beautiful buildings for the climate change era. Laura, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Laura, thanks for joining us. Your piece focuses on Studio Ma. As Vanessa mentioned, they're based in Phoenix. Why do you think their work in the desert is so important for understanding the future of sustainable building, kind of beyond the desert even?
Yeah, so Studio Ma was founded in 2003 by a husband and wife team, architects Christiana Moss and Christopher Alt. And they've really dedicated themselves to designing with a warming planet in mind in one of the hottest cities and regions in the United States. And this boils down to maximizing daylight, but also protecting a building's occupants from the relentless desert heat, while also minimizing energy consumption. As Christiana has said, she lives in an extreme environment, but that environment anticipates a warming planet. It anticipates what could happen to other cities across the globe.
And I think in the piece you describe, or the way that Studio Ma describes their kind of design philosophy is desert urbanism. Can you kind of unpack what desert urbanism even means?
The way that they describe it is they believe buildings should be oriented east-west to avoid maximum sun exposure and heat gain. Buildings should incorporate substantial shade on a large scale whenever there's any type of glass and glazing. And they should capture breezes through a series of shaded passive spaces. And these moves are really nothing new. And smart architects in the desert, including the Pueblo Indians, have been building this way for many, many years. But unfortunately, developers and luxury buyers still want swaths of unshaded glass and glass towers, which you can see all over downtown Phoenix.
Studio Ma used some interesting climate software, it sounds like, to help manage sunlight in one of their recent projects at Arizona State. Could you walk us through how this tool informed their design?
Studio Ma has been a beta tester for a software called Climate Studio. And this Climate Studio software is one of the fastest and most accurate simulation tools on the market. So Studio Ma began to play with the facade and the massing to see which tweaks would result in the optimal daylighting, but the least amount of energy used for this dorm at ASU. And ultimately, through the software, they found that faceting the north facade helped them get there because facets help shade buildings. Cladding the building in alternating solid and lattice panels of high-performance concrete helped the building shade itself. And the software just kept giving them this real-world feedback along the way about how to get the best performing building, but also design something that would be comfortable to occupants and pleasant to be in and contain all the programming it needed to contain.
One of the things I'm really interested in is passive house design. It's kind of been considered maybe the gold standard in sustainable construction in a lot of new buildings. But in your piece, you pointed out that passive house isn't always the best option in the desert. Can you explain why that is the case?
A lot of architects are now using passive house standards. But as Christiana Moss pointed out to me, passive house has an emphasis on triple window glazing and a super tight building envelope. And that makes sense in the Northeast where we have long, cold winters. It's not necessarily the most cost-effective way to achieve net zero construction in the desert or get close to net zero construction. You can get similar results by putting your money towards different elements, such as adding more solar panels or using a different mechanical system or changing the orientation of your building. So Studio Ma typically pursues what they believe is an even more progressive and holistic certification called the Living Building Challenge, which does incorporate some of the same tenets as passive house, but also requires that projects generate all their own energy with renewable resources, capture and treat their own water. So it's a bit more of an aggressive standard.
Okay, Laura, last one and we'll let you go here. This might call for a little speculation on your part, but I wondered if you get the sense in doing this story of whether the field of architecture is prepared for a warming future or if we still have a ways to go.
Yeah, I think the answer is both. I think architects on the whole have made great strides in the last couple of decades to eliminate CO2 emissions from new buildings. And I think the American Institute of Architects has really helped lead this mandate by asking its members to commit to the 2030 challenge, which asks the global architecture community to meet energy consumption and emission standards, among other things. But I also think that on the flip side, architects still answer all too often to developers, many of whom care about their bottom line and not necessarily the environment. So I think there's still also a long way to go.
Hopefully there's some progressive developers out there too that are going to move the needle.
Yes.
Sure. Hopefully efforts like Studio Ma can kind of help them see that you don't have to choose either or.
Exactly.
Laura, thank you so much.
Thanks, Laura.
Thanks for having me.
It's now time for our final segment, The Last Smile. In this segment, we set aside the depressing news of the week and focus on something happy for a minute each. Eric, what had you smiling?
So what had me smiling was this blog post here on the Kotka blog. It was actually picked up from a New York Times story, and the headline says, "Cute laundry shop couple stylishly models clothes left behind by their patrons." So, you know, I'm a sucker for the A+ headline, and that is one here. But the story is really, really fun. You got two octogenarian laundromat owners in Taiwan. We talked about Taiwan last week. They're doing great with their response to COVID for a number of reasons. But these two octogenarian laundromat owners are really thriving. They're living their best laundry lives. Their grandkid had the idea of putting kind of the clothes that people left behind in the laundromat. He put it on them, and then he took really great posed Instagram photos of them. They're like posing in hipster outfits. The audio doesn't really do it justice here, but I folks should check it out.
And I remember, Eric, that you almost lost some laundry to a laundromat at the beginning of COVID. I would have loved to have seen the photos of your laundromat owner wearing your clothes around.
I'm happy to report they're back in action. That is also a last smile. They were out of action for a bit with COVID, but they're back. We're supporting them, and laundromats everywhere. We're with you.
That's great.
All right, Vanessa, what do you got?
So this was a little write-up of a new documentary in the New York Times by Kristen Yinsu Kim. She's writing about a documentary called City Dreamers, and it follows 4 female architects who were kind of at the vanguard of the industry, which was a very male-dominated profession in the 20th century, right?
And still kind of, yeah.
That's true, for sure. And what was interesting to me is, as someone who supposedly knows a lot about architecture history, is that I only knew the names of two of these women. So Phyllis Lambert, very famous for her work with Mies van der Rohe, and Denise Scott Brown, also very famous, kind of famously snubbed for a Pritzker Prize when her husband received it. So those two names I knew quite well, but I did not know about Cornelia Hahn Oberlander or Blanche Lemko van Ginkel. So I'm really excited to go check out this documentary and learn more about them. And the film seems to be available to rent or buy on iTunes or Amazon. So you can check out the trailer and then maybe even check out the movie.
And you can learn a thing or two.
Absolutely.
All right, folks, time is up. Thank you for joining us this week.
If you want to read the stories we discussed today and many more, then sign up for the Sidewalk Weekly newsletter at sidewalklabs.com.
We should note that the views expressed in the Sidewalk Weekly don't necessarily reflect Sidewalk's company position.
And if you think we're missing a perspective, let us know. Send an email or voice memo to podcast@sidewalklabs.com. We might just talk about it in a future episode.
The Sidewalk Weekly is produced by Vanessa and me. This episode was edited by Zach McNeese. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions, and our art is by the great Tim Cow. See you next time.
Bye.